In the summer of 2003, every farmer in Pratt County, Kansas, did the same thing when the rains stopped coming. They called the drainage contractor, they scheduled the tile installation, they borrowed against next year's crop to pay for it, and they did it without a second thought, because that is what you did in Pratt County when the ground got wet in spring and dry in summer. Tile drainage was not a decision. It was gravity. It was weather. It was the same as planting winter wheat in October and cutting it in June and hauling it to the elevator on Highway 61 and taking whatever price Cargill was offering that week. Nobody chose tile drainage the way nobody chooses to breathe. You did it because your father did it, and his father did it, and the county extension agent recommended it, and the drainage contractor had a 6-week backlog every March because every farmer in Pratt County was calling him at the same time, all of them doing the same thing, none of them asking why. Let me tell you about what Pratt County looked like in 2003, because you need to understand the world before you can understand what one 22-year-old woman did to it. The county ran flat from the Oklahoma border north through 60 miles of hard red soil and short grass prairie, interrupted by the occasional tree line or dry creek bed that only ran in wet years. The farms were big. 600 acres, 800 acres, some of them over 1,000, and they were almost uniformly planted in winter wheat, with a rotation of grain sorghum on the driest ground. The elevator in Pratt was the center of commerce, the way the church was the center of community, and the co-op on Maple Street was the center of everything else. On Friday mornings, the co-op coffee table held court with 6 or 8 farmers who had been sitting in those same chairs for 20 years. And what was said at that table was, for practical purposes, the agricultural policy of Pratt County. The Heller farm sat 7 miles south of town on a county road that turned to gravel after the first mile. Robert Heller had farmed it for 31 years, taking it over from his own father in 1972, with 480 acres of wheat ground and a debt load that took him 15 years to clear. He was methodical and consistent, and not given to risk. He planted the same varieties his neighbors planted, used the same inputs, hired the same custom harvester every June, and delivered his wheat to the same elevator his father had used. His yields were average for the county, 38 to 44 bushels per acre in good years, 22 to 28 in dry years, and he considered that acceptable. He had survived the farm crisis of the 1980s by being careful, and being careful had become the organizing principle of his life. He did not gamble, he did not innovate, he did not read the agricultural journals his daughter kept leaving on the kitchen table. His daughter was Claire Heller, and she had just come home from 4 years at Kansas State University with a degree in agronomy and a head full of ideas that Pratt County was not going to enjoy hearing. Let me tell you about Claire Heller, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from every character this channel has told you about. She was 22 years old in the summer of 2003, 5'4", and she came back to the farm wearing a Kansas State jacket and carrying a canvas bag full of notebooks and printed research papers with highlighted passages and margin notes in 3 colors of ink. She had grown up on this farm, walked these fields with her father since she was old enough to walk, and understood the soil the way you understand something you have touched every day for your entire life. But she had also spent 4 years sitting in the classrooms of a man named Dr. Paul Garrett, a soil scientist at K-State who had spent 30 years studying dryland farming systems in semi-arid regions, and what she had learned in those classrooms had changed the way she saw every acre of her father's farm. She had come home with a proposal. It was, by Pratt County standards, insane. She did not want to tile the south field. That was the beginning of it, and that was the thing that made no sense to anyone who heard it, because the south field was the wettest ground on the Heller farm. It sat in a slight depression that collected runoff from the higher ground to the north and east, and in wet springs it puddled badly and delayed planting by 2 or 3 weeks, which cost yield, which cost money. Every farmer who had looked at that field for 30 years had said the same thing. Tile it. Get the water out. Drain it fast and plant it on time and stop losing weeks at the front end of the season. Robert Heller had been meaning to tile that field for 5 years and simply hadn't gotten around to spending the money. Claire did not want to tile it. She wanted to do something else entirely. She wanted to convert it to dryland sunflowers and establish a native grass waterway through the center of it. And she wanted to let the natural depression function as a shallow recharge zone for the aquifer below. She had the science to back it up. Let me tell you about the science, because it is the reason she was right, and the reason nobody believed her. And those two things are connected. Dr. Garrett's research, which Claire had spent 2 semesters studying in detail, focused on what he called the hidden cost of aggressive drainage in semi-arid farming systems. The argument was not complicated, but it was counterintuitive, which is why it had trouble getting traction in counties like Pratt. When you tile a field aggressively, when you install subsurface drainage pipe at 4-foot depths on 30-foot centers, which was the standard installation in south-central Kansas, you move water off the field faster than the soil can absorb it. In a wet year, this is exactly what you want. You get the field dry, you get it planted, you get your wheat in the ground on schedule. But in a dry year, and in the years following a dry year, you have also removed the water that would have recharged the shallow aquifer beneath your farm. You have traded long-term water storage for short-term field access. In a county that averaged 19 inches of rainfall per year and was drawing on an aquifer that was already declining at 2 to 3 feet annually, this was not a neutral trade. It was a slow-motion crisis that nobody was measuring because everybody was too busy being grateful for dry fields in April. Claire's research notes cited 3 field studies from the Texas Panhandle and 2 from western Nebraska, where farmers had preserved natural depression areas as passive recharge zones and measured statistically significant differences in shallow water table depth over 5- and 10-year periods. The numbers were specific. Farms with preserved recharge zones maintained water tables that were, on average, 4 to 7 feet higher than neighboring farms with equivalent drainage infrastructure after a 2-year drought sequence. At the depths, the Ogallala Aquifer was sitting in Pratt County, 80 to 120 feet in most places, but as shallow as 40 feet under the Heller Farm's south section. 4 to 7 feet of difference was not a rounding error. It was the difference between a working irrigation well and a dry hole. The sunflower piece was the other half of the argument. Sunflowers had a taproot system that could reach 6 to 8 feet into the soil profile, compared to winter wheat's root system of 18 to 24 inches. In a drought year, sunflowers could access moisture that wheat could not reach. They also produced $180 to $220 per acre at 2003 prices versus $90 to $120 per acre for wheat at typical Pratt County yields, and they required significantly less nitrogen input. Claire had built a 5-year financial model in a spiral notebook that showed the south field generating $40 to $60 per acre more in net revenue than wheat, even accounting for the learning curve and the cost of the native grass waterway establishment. She brought this to the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in late June, 3 days after she had come home from Manhattan. She spread the notebooks out next to the salt shaker and the butter dish and walked her father through it while her mother, Diane, stood at the sink washing dishes and listening without appearing to listen. Robert Heller heard her out. He did not interrupt. He looked at the notebooks and the highlighted papers and the 5-year financial model. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Claire, I've been farming this ground for 31 years. That south field needs tile." He said it the way you state a fact about the weather, not unkindly, just finally. The kitchen went quiet. Diane stopped washing. She set a glass down on the drying rack without a sound and turned slightly toward the table. She did not say anything yet. Claire said, "I know that's what it looks like, but the tile is what's going to hurt us when the dry years come back. And they're going to come back, Dad. They always come back." Robert looked at the notebooks again. He picked up one of the research papers and looked at it without reading it, the way a man looks at something when he is deciding whether to take it seriously. He set it down. "I need to think about it," he said. Diane, still facing the sink, said quietly, "She's right, you know, about the dry years." She did not elaborate. She went back to washing dishes. Robert looked at his wife's back for a moment, and then looked at his daughter, and then looked at his coffee cup. He did not say yes, but he did not schedule the tile contractor. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened 3 weeks later, because it is the reason this story has the shape it has. Claire had made the mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake, perhaps it was inevitable, of mentioning her idea to Don Fassbender at the co-op on a Tuesday morning when she had gone in to pick up a bag of seed treatment. Don Fassbender was 63 years old and had been selling seed, fertilizer, and crop insurance to Pratt County farmers for 35 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had watched a lot of young people come back from college with ideas and then watched those ideas fail. And he had drawn the conclusion from this that ideas from young people with college degrees were not to be trusted, which is the kind of conclusion that feels like wisdom when it is actually just pattern recognition applied too broadly. Claire had not meant to get into it with him. She had mentioned the sunflowers offhandedly, the way you mention something you're thinking about, and Don had looked at her over the top of his reading glasses and said, "Sunflowers in a wheat field." He said it the way you repeat something back to a child who has said something that doesn't make sense. "In the South Depression," Claire said, "with a native grass waterway, and no tile." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Don Fassbender started laughing. It was not a mean laugh. That is what made it worse. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely found something funny. The laugh of a man who is so certain of his position that the alternative strikes him as comedy rather than threat. He laughed the way you laugh at a joke everyone in the room already knows the punchline to, and he looked around at the 2 other farmers who were standing near the seed display, and they smiled in the reflexive way people smile when someone with authority signals that something is amusing. "Your daddy know about this?" Don said, still smiling. "It was my proposal," Claire said. "He's considering it." "Well," Don said, picking up his clipboard, "you tell Robert that if he wants to grow sunflowers in his wet ground instead of tiling it like every other sensible farmer in this county, he's going to be buying a lot of crop insurance from me. Because sunflowers in a depression field in Pratt County is a way to lose money slowly." He paused. "Or fast, depending on the year. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been laughed at for knowing something that the person laughing at you did not know? Not dismissed, laughed at, because there is a particular quality to that experience that shapes what comes next. Claire Heller was 22 years old, and she was standing in a feed store in the county she had grown up in, holding a bag of seed treatment, and the man behind the counter was laughing at her in front of her neighbors. She had 4 years of agronomy education and 2 semesters of specific research on dryland water management and a 5-year financial model in a spiral notebook in her truck. And none of that mattered to Dawn Fassbender because she was 22 and female and had gone to college instead of farming. And in Pratt County in 2003, that combination did not buy you the right to be taken seriously. She did not argue. She paid for her seed treatment, and she walked out to her truck and she drove the 7 miles home on the county road, and she sat in the cab for a few minutes before she went inside. That evening, Robert Heller told his daughter she could plant sunflowers on the south field, all 90 acres of it. No tile. The native grass waterway down the center. He said it without preamble, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, as if he'd been thinking about it all day and had arrived at a place. "You'll manage it yourself," he said. "I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but if it doesn't work, we tile it next spring." He looked at her. "Fair?" She said it was fair. Let me tell you about the fall of 2003, because it was the first chapter of the proof. Claire ordered open-pollinated sunflower seed from a supplier in Nebraska, a variety called Hopi Black Dye that Dr. Garrett had flagged in his research as having exceptional drought tolerance and deep root development. And she established 12 pounds of native grass seed mix along the natural drainage channel through the center of the field, a blend of big bluestem, side oats grama, and buffalo grass that she had sourced from a restoration nursery in Hutchinson. She planted the sunflowers in late May, 3 weeks after her neighbors had their wheat in the bin, and she watched them emerge in rows that were slightly irregular because she had adjusted the row spacing to follow the microtopography of the field, rather than running perfectly parallel to the fence line, which was the kind of thing that looked wrong to every farmer who drove past on the county road and made them slow down and stare. The sunflowers grew. They grew in the way that plants grow when they are suited to the ground they are in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and with a quality of rightness that Claire recognized from Dr. Garrett's field photos. By mid-July, the plants were 6 feet tall, and the native grass stripped down the center was establishing itself in a green ribbon that held the soil along the drainage channel. The field looked nothing like a wheat field. It looked like something from a different county, a different state, a different agricultural tradition entirely. Farmers who had known Robert Heller for 30 years slowed their pickups on the county road and looked at it without stopping, the way you look at something you are not sure how to categorize. Claire harvested 1,840 pounds per acre from the south field that fall, which, at the 2003 price of $0.115 per pound, worked out to $211.60 per acre gross. Her input costs, seed, fuel, drying, ran $68 per acre, leaving her $143.60 per acre net. The wheat ground on the rest of the farm averaged $104 per acre net that year, which was a decent wheat year. The south field, on the worst ground on the farm, had out-earned the best wheat ground by $39.60 per acre. Robert Heller looked at the numbers at the kitchen table in November and did not say much, but he did not mention the tile contractor. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op that winter, because it is part of the story even though it is small. Don Fassbender heard the sunflower yield numbers through the agricultural grapevine that connects every farm in a small county, and he did not say anything publicly. He did not acknowledge that the numbers existed. He continued to sell seed and fertilizer and crop insurance, and when the subject of the Heller Farm's South Field came up at the Friday morning coffee table, he said that one good year didn't prove anything, that sunflowers were a niche market, that Claire Heller was going to learn a hard lesson when the market moved against her. He said it with the authority of 35 years behind the counter, and the men at the table nodded, because Don Fassbender had been right about most things for most of their farming lives, and one good year from a 22-year-old agronomist was not enough to unseat that. The 2004 season was average. Claire planted 90 acres of sunflowers again, added a cover crop of winter rye on the surrounding wheat ground to begin building organic matter, and continued to let the South Depression function as a recharge zone. Her yield that year was 1,710 pounds per acre, slightly lower than 2003 due to a dry August, but her input costs had dropped to $61 per acre as she refined her management, and her net came in at $135.50 per acre versus the farm's wheat average of $98 per acre. The gap was narrowing slightly, but still clear. She had now out-earned the wheat ground 2 years running on the field everyone said should be tiled. She had also been monitoring the water table. She had installed a simple observation well in the south field in the spring of 2003, a 4-inch PVC pipe driven to 50 feet with a perforated bottom section, and she had been measuring the water level monthly with a weighted tape measure. In the spring of 2003, the water table under the south field sat at 43 feet. In the spring of 2004, after one full season of allowing the depression to function as a recharge zone, it sat at 41.5 feet, 1.5 feet of recovery in one season. She wrote it in her notebook in blue ink and circled it. Let me tell you about the summer of 2005, because that is when the proof stopped being a matter of opinion. The drought that hit south-central Kansas in the summer of 2005 was not the worst drought in county memory. That distinction belonged to 1956, but it was the worst in 40 years, and it arrived with the particular cruelty of droughts that begin in winter and simply never end. The 2004 to 2005 wheat crop had gone in dry and come up thin and struggled through a cold January and a dry February and a March with no meaningful precipitation, and by April it was clear that the county was in serious trouble. The wheat that did survive to harvest in June yielded 14 to 18 bushels per acre county-wide, which was roughly half a normal crop. Grain sorghum planted in May went into dust and either didn't emerge or emerged installed in July when the subsoil moisture was gone. The county agent's office in Pratt was fielding calls from farmers who were talking about cutting their losses and doing emergency hay, which is what you do when you have given up on the crop. The Heller Farm's wheat ground yielded 16 bushels per acre in 2005. Robert Heller was not happy about it, but he was not in crisis. He had crop insurance. He had a reserve. He had been careful for 30 years in preparation for years like this one. He was watching his neighbors more carefully than he was watching his own fields, because some of them were not going to be okay. Claire's sunflowers went into the south field in late May of 2005, into soil that was dry on top, but had something underneath it that the surrounding wheat ground did not. The observation well in the south field read 40.2 feet in May of 2005. The water table had continued to rise, now 2.8 feet higher than when she had started. The surrounding farms, which had been aggressively tiled for years and had no recharge zones, were drawing on aquifer water that was declining. Claire's irrigation well, a small supplemental well that the farm used only in extreme years, pulled water from 44 feet. She ran it twice in July for a total of 6 hours, applying 3/4 of an inch of water to the sunflower field at the most critical stage of head development. That was the difference. She harvested 1,620 pounds per acre from the south field in September of 2005. In a drought year that had devastated every conventional crop in the county, in the year that the co-op was processing more crop insurance claims than in any year since 1988, Claire Heller's sunflower field on the worst ground on the farm yielded 1,620 pounds per acre and netted $127 per acre. The wheat ground on the Heller farm netted $31 per acre after insurance. 3 neighboring farms that had installed aggressive tile drainage in 2001 and 2002, farms that had sacrificed their recharge zones for dry fields in April, reported irrigation wells that had dropped 8 to 11 feet during the drought and were pumping sand in August. One of them had abandoned 200 acres of grain sorghum in July and taken the total loss. Robert Heller sat at the kitchen table in October of 2005 with Claire's notebooks in front of him and the farm's financial records beside them, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were right about the dry years." He said it the way a man says something he has been working up to for 2 years, simply and without drama, looking at the table rather than at his daughter. Claire did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She said it without triumph. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Robert looked up. He said, "You decide the rotation. All 480 acres. I'll keep doing the field work, but the management decisions are yours." He picked up his coffee cup. "Fair?" She said it was fair. "Let me tell you about the morning Don Fassbender drove out to the Heller farm, because it is the part of this story that matters most, and the part that is hardest to describe. It was a Tuesday in November of 2005, 6 weeks after harvest, and Claire was in the machine shed doing maintenance on the planter when she heard a truck on the gravel. She recognized the truck. She wiped her hands on a shop rag and walked out into the thin November light. Don Fassbender was 65 years old and had spent 37 years being the person other people came to for answers, and it showed in the way he got out of his truck, carefully, as if he was not entirely sure of his footing on unfamiliar ground. He was wearing his co-op jacket and his seed corn cap, and he looked at Claire with an expression that was not quite an apology and not quite a request, and was somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between them. "I've got a few farmers asking me about sunflowers," he said. He said it to the gravel. Claire looked at him. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "Don, you told me I was going to learn a hard lesson." She said it without anger, the way you quote something back to someone when you want them to hear it out loud. "You said 1 good year doesn't prove anything." Don Fassbender looked at the machine shed. He looked at the gravel. He said, "I know what I said." "The lesson isn't that sunflowers are better than wheat," Claire said. "The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. And the lesson is that when you tile every depression and drain every wet spot and strip every recharge zone out of this county, you're borrowing water from the future and pretending it's free. And when the drought comes, and it always comes, you find out what it cost." She paused. That's what I would tell your farmers." Don Fassbender nodded slowly. He looked at the south field, which was bare and brown and resting under November sky, the native grass stripped down the center still faintly green at the roots. He said, "You got anything written up I could share with them?" She went inside and got him a copy of the research papers and a summary she had written herself, 2 pages, clear and specific, with the yield numbers and the water table data and the input cost comparisons. She handed it to him at his truck. He took it without meeting her eyes. He drove back down the county road toward town. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end in 2005. By 2008, 11 farms in Pratt County had established sunflower rotations. By 2010, the county extension agent, a different one than had been there in 2003, a younger man who had read Dr. Garrett's research in graduate school, was hosting field days at the Heller farm in August when the sunflowers were at full head and farmers were standing in the field rows with their boots in the soil, asking Claire questions about variety selection and row spacing and waterway establishment. She answered every question. She had, by then, converted 200 acres of the Heller farm to a 4-crop rotation: winter wheat, sunflowers, grain sorghum, and a winter cover crop blend, and the farm's average net revenue per acre had increased from $104 in 2003 to $161 in 2010, a 55% improvement on the same land base with the same equipment and the same family. She had also been invited to speak at the Kansas No-Till Conference in Salina in February of 2009, which was the first time she had presented her water table data to an audience larger than a field day. She stood at a podium in a hotel conference room with 340 farmers and agronomists in the seats, and she walked through 7 years of observation, well data and yield comparisons and per-acre revenue figures. And when she was done, the room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Robert Heller was sitting in the 3rd row. When the applause started, he stood up. He was the first person to stand. Claire saw him from the podium, and for a moment she could not speak, and she did not try to. Let me tell you about the summer of 2019, because that is where the story earns its ending. Claire was 38 years old and had been managing the Heller farm for 16 years. Her father had retired from active field work in 2014, but still walked the fields every morning, and her mother still ran the farm's financial records. The farm had grown to 640 acres through the purchase of a neighboring parcel, and it was running a diversified rotation that included sunflowers, grain sorghum, winter wheat, and a recently established 40-acre block of food-grade confection sunflowers under contract to a specialty processor in Wichita. Claire's daughter, Maya, was 15 years old and had been walking the fields with her mother since she was old enough to walk, the same way Claire had walked them with Robert. Maya was quiet and observant and kept a notebook of her own, which she had started at age 12 after finding a box of her mother's old research notes in the machine shed. In July of 2019, Maya came to the kitchen table with her notebook and a printed article from a regenerative agriculture journal, and said she wanted to talk about integrating a small beef cattle herd into the rotation using managed grazing on the cover crop acres. Claire looked at the notebook. She looked at the article. She looked at her daughter. She did not ask how old she was or whether she had enough experience or what the neighbors would think. She said, "Walk me through the numbers." Maya opened the notebook and started talking, and Claire listened the way her father had never quite managed to listen in the beginning, with her full attention and without the weight of 30 years of doing it the same way pressing down on every word. Robert Heller was sitting at the end of the table with his coffee, and he listened too. And after a while he looked at his daughter, and something passed between them that did not need to be said. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing this story is actually about. The south field on the Heller farm has never been tiled. The observation well that Claire drove into the ground in the spring of 2003 is still there, capped with a plastic plug, and she still measures it every spring with a weighted tape. In 2023, 20 years after she came home from Kansas State with a canvas bag full of notebooks and a proposal that made Don Fassbender laugh, the water table under the south field sits at 37.4 feet. It has risen 5.6 feet in 20 years. The neighboring farms that tiled aggressively in the early 2000s are reporting water tables that have dropped an average of 14 feet over the same period. The aquifer is still declining in Pratt County, but it is declining more slowly under the farms that listened. Don Fassbender retired in 2012. He came to one of the field days at the Heller farm in 2010, 2 years before he retired, and he stood in the back of the group and listened to Claire talk about water table management and crop diversification, and he did not say anything, and nobody made him. That was enough. Claire Heller still farms the same 640 acres. She still carries a notebook. The first sunflower field she ever planted is in its 20th rotation, and the native grass waterway down the center has grown into a dense, rooted ribbon of big bluestem and buffalo grass that holds the soil through every wind and every rain and every dry summer that comes across the Oklahoma border looking for something to take. She planted sunflowers in a wheat county. They laughed. The drought came, the wheat died, the sunflowers lived, the water table held, and the notebook was right all along.